This recreation is of a woman's skirt from 1925 from this image taken of Edna St. Vincent Millay by the photographer Berenice Abbott. I believe this part of the image is the hem of the skirt and Millay's knee. I found the pattern for the skirt on Etsy. There are many historical and historical reproduction patterns for sale there.
I found this pattern for 1925 travel suit. The length looks good and it has a skirt that goes with it. So I think this is all I'll need for the suit part.
The pattern was a print-at-home pattern. You cut out and tape each piece of paper together to get the larger final piece. This does take a while. Once the pattern is taped together, you cut along the lines to get the shape for the mock-up. The mock-up is cut from unbleached muslin and seamed together on the machine. There are 2 skirt panels and 6 darts to sew up. The seams and the darts are then pressed with a steam iron. Now this skirt pattern had a large flap that wrapped around the front. I didn't realize this while sewing the mock-up and was very confused as to why the waist was so big. Millay's skirt does not wrap around, so I would have to change the pattern anyway. I ended up taking a lot out of the skirt. I took it out of the mock-up and seamed up a new line and tried it on. The skirt panels were separated and pressed flat so that the pattern could be altered. The alterations keep the silhouette since the original large overlapping flap at the front would have created a narrow silhouette like my alterations also have.
So the skirt pattern says that the front center is actually on the larger piece instead of the smaller piece, which is what I was interpreting it. But because I have to take so much out of the waistline, I'm going to have to make the smaller piece center front instead of the larger piece because I'm taking about like this much off anyway.
I then traced the altered pattern onto the wrong side of the same suiting wool that I used for the jacket. The pieces were then cut out. I decided to stitch the darts up by hand since my 1906 sewing machine doesn't backstitch and I thought this would create a cleaner finished look. Once the darts were stitched, they were pressed on a tailor's ham. My books all instruct to cut the darts open and whip stitch the raw edges to prevent unraveling. This wool frayed a lot, and since it was so thin, the darts didn't really show through on the other side. I chose not to split them as I was worried about them fraying too much.
So here's the diagram of how to make this kind of waistband. It instructs you basically to baste it in place and try it on first to make sure that everything fits before you sew it into place. But this is the placket here with snaps. There's a piece of binding here with a snap on the edge for the very corner, and then there's hooks and eyes sewn onto what is a Petersham band, which is a particular kind of ribbon. Petersham basically has an edge with little scallops on it from the weaving, so there's not like a thread running all the way along, so it has some stretch to it to go around a slightly curved waistband.
The only Petersham that I could buy that was in the correct size has these polka dots on it. You can see it is actually Petersham. So I'm going to use this side, and it was either this green or brown, I think. So I also bought some synthetic fabric dye in the darkest blue they had. So I'm going to cut my waistband and dye it using the dye to get the correct color, and then use it the wrong way out. I think also historically it would not have been synthetic, but that's my only option is this. So I'm going to do my best to make it work.
I dyed the Petersham, thoroughly wetting the ribbon before putting it into the dye bath as per the instructions. While the Petersham was dyeing, I loaded the bobbin for the sewing machine and seamed up the skirt. I then pressed the seams open and flat so that I could top stitch them. The instructions for skirt seams are to top stitch over both raw edges. To begin with, I only top stitched the side of the skirt without the placket. Here, all the darts and both sides are stitched and one side is top stitched. The placket isn't inserted yet.
So the placket I chose to do is actually just using one strip of fabric that attaches to both edges and sort of has this double fold that you end up stitching down. And this works really well. So this is the instructions that I followed, those written instructions, and then also the diagrams that show you how to make this kind of placket.
The placket is measured and cut out, then pinned into place and stitched entirely by hand using a running back stitch on the first seam. I then folded and whip stitched the placket down on both sides. It was late at night and I did a pretty bad job of this on the visible side because you can see where it's been stitched, but I decided to deal with this problem later.
So the next step, this is one of the side seams, the one that has the placket. I didn't top stitch that yet, so I'm going to top stitch that. I've just pinned it. So I stitched this line. I have the ends of the thread here. I didn't back stitch it because it's visible. So I'm going to take these thread ends, put them on a needle, put them through and secure them off on the other side, and then press this seam, and both of my seams are now done. My placket is done. I'm ready to attach the waistband. I have this 1940s reproduction skirt that I made in 2023. And I followed the exact same instructions that I am following now for the waistband for this skirt. So the waistband, the placket is slightly different, but I'm still going to attach the snaps like I have here. And then the placket is very simple. It's just the edge of the skirt is folded over the same width as a seam allowance. And then the placket, you've cross-stitched the edge of the placket over, attached your hooks and loops, and then whipped the placket onto the wool slightly further down, so from the front you can't see it. And that is the instruction that's given in the 1920s book about how to make a skirt band. And there are examples of this even going further back. In this 1905 dress in Janet Arnold's Patterns of Fashion 2, you can see that a waistband is attached in a similar manner. Obviously it's covered here by the belt that's put on, but it is in a similar sort of style of hooks and eyes attached along the top that closes on the side. And that's what is touching your waist rather than this part of the skirt which flares out a little bit, which is the same for this 1940s reproduction and is the same for the 1920s one that I'm currently sewing.
Go back and undo the placket I had sewn on visibly. I did this to attach the snaps only to the placket fabric so that the sewing wouldn't show to the right side, and also to redo the whip stitches to make them less visible. I used antique snaps and sewed them on following the instructions in the book that show you how to do it that you can see on screen. When whip stitching the placket down, I made sure to only catch the inside threads of the fabric so that it would be invisible from the right side. With the placket done, I moved on to the waistband. For attaching the waistband, I pinned and pressed down the top seam allowance. I then basted it into place, removing the pins as I went.
Now in the instructions for this kind of waistband, it does tell you that this is a kind of skirt that can't be washed because you shouldn't wash Petersham. You can see how sort of solid this ribbon is and how this is a lot softer now, and that because I had to dye it. So there is some kind of stiffening in the original Petersham that clearly got washed out, but I'm just gonna have to work with it because I don't have any starch here to starch this with, and I think it's fine. It's still, it's not like, you know, super soft, and I think it will work.
Following the instructions, I cross-stitched the edges of the Petersham and then attached antique hooks and eyes. The hooks are set flush to the edge and the eyes stand proud the tiniest amount. These are then sewed on. I sewed one side of a snap onto some black tulle tape and then whip stitched this over the exposed edge not covered by the Petersham. That was the last step, and now here is the finished waistband and placket.
This shows the hem here. So the hem is folded up, basted into place, and then another thin piece of fabric is basted into place on top of the hem, and then it says it should be sewn down, catching only the folded up part of the hem, and then the top is then basted into place and then sewn in place. And this is how I'll do the hem.
I then cut the skirt to length and pinned up the hem. The edge of the binding was basted into place. This is the same silk lining that I bought for the jacket. The bottom of the binding is running stitched to the hem, and the top is whip stitch, catching only the inside threads of the fabric so it doesn't show through to the right side. This was very time consuming. I found a comfortable spot and finished the hemming, and this was the last step. And here is the front of the finished skirt, the side with the placket, and the back where you can see the darts. And the closure. And the hem. Here is the hem and side seam. Here is a comparison between my recreation and the original image.